Hi everybody, this is Ryan and lesson 26 of working with JavaScript. In this lesson we'll be doing some animation. So we need to link to a CSS document and we also need a external JavaScript file. So I'm going to need some pictures for this. I've got two sailing boats, one pointing to the left and one pointing to the right. So I'll start by putting in an image of the sailing boat that's pointing to the right. And I'll give it an ID so we can manipulate it using JavaScript. So let's just take a look quickly at this. There's the sailing boat pointing to the right. The object of this lesson is to get this sailing boat to move slowly to the right of the edge of the screen, to turn around and come back again. So I'm going to start by getting rid of this little margin here on the left hand side. So with CSS we're going to just switch off the margin. Otherwise it's going to factor the calculation out a little bit. Okay, so now that we have removed the margin, we can go and do some coding. Create a global variable for the picture. And then we need to initialize that. Document.getElement by ID can be used to retrieve that image tag. By default, the image will be statically positioned in the document, so I'm going to change this with style sheets. We're going to make it relative position. That way we can then animate it. And then I'm also going to set the left position to 0 pixels. This is relative to where it was when it first started out. And then we'll call a function called sailRight, which we'll create over here. The purpose of this function is to actually move the boat to the right. So before we can do that, we need to retrieve the current position. Which will be 0 pixels initially. That's a string. So I would like to just get the integer portion of that. So I'm going to use a function that I taught you right at the beginning of the JavaScript course. ParseInt just extracts the integer portion from the beginning of a string. Now that I know it's an integer, I can just increment that value. And then I can set the new value of the left style property to that value. I'm also going to add on the unit of measurement as well. I want this function to repeat itself over and over again. So we're going to use that window.setTimeout property that we've used in the previous two lessons to call the function after a certain number of milliseconds. I'm going to use 20 milliseconds just to make this animation as smooth as possible. Okay, and there you can see the boat sailing across the screen. One problem we have is that once it reaches at the end of the browser, it continues off the edge of the screen because it doesn't know what the width of the browser is. So to calculate that width, I'm going to just create a global variable. We'll call it BW. For browser width, and I'll write a function to calculate the width of the browser. So we'll call it calc width. Now in most modern browsers you can calculate the width of the browser by using the inner the inner width property of the window object. This will work for everything except Internet Explorer 8 and below. So for Internet Explorer 8 and below, we need to use document.body.clientWidth. So we need an if statement to test what browser we're using. So I'm going to do this using a ternary operator. So if the window.innerWidth property exists, we'll return the window.innerWidth. Alternatively, we'll return document.body.clientWidth. Okay, so now I need to define the value for the browser width by calling that function calcWidth. So that function will then return the value and store it in the global variable BW, which is the browser width. Here I can then do a test to see if the current position of the sailing boat is still smaller than the edge of the browser. If it is, then we can increase the value of that current position and then set the window timer again. Alternatively, if it's now reached the right hand edge of the screen, we will change the source of the image to point in the other direction, and then we will call a function called sail left to begin the process of sailing in the left hand direction. So I need to write a new function now to sail to the left, and it's going to be a similar process. We need to get the current value or the current position of the sailing boat, and then if the current position is still larger than 0, in other words, if it's still sailing towards the left of the browser, I can then decrease the value of the current position and then set the new position to that position, and then after 20 milliseconds call the sail left function again. Else, in other words, if it's now reached the left hand edge of the screen, we will set the source of the image to point to the right again, and we will call the sail right function. So let us test our masterpiece. So it sails towards the right hand edge of the browser. Once it gets to the edge, it should turn around and come back. Notice that it did go off the edge of the screen a little bit. It actually went off the edge of the screen by the same width as the image itself. So I'm going to have a look quickly at what the image width is. It's actually 74 pixels. So I'm going to subtract that in my calculation. So I'm saying if the current position is smaller than the width of the browser minus the width of the image, in that way we should have a much better effect. So now it should turn around when the right hand edge of the image gets to the edge of the browser. There we go. So that's our animation. And just to make things even more clever, if I resize the browser while the animation's in progress, you'll notice that it still turns around at the original point where the browser was. So we have a special event handler in JavaScript called window.onResize. In other words, when the window resizes, we can actually call a function and then reset the browser width. So we're gonna set the browser width twice. Initially we'll set it, and then if the window is resized for any given reason, it will just recalculate the browser width again. Let's test this. So I refresh. It thinks the browser width is there, but if I resize the browser on the fly, it should have recalculated the browser width and then turn around again. And that is the end of our lesson in animation. I hope you've enjoyed it. Feel free to revise the video just to become familiar with all the concepts that we've dealt with.